a few moments. Oh. We still have a steady stream of people joining us, which is great. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Just one more moment and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started so we don't waste any of our precious time this evening. First, I'd like to say good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kelsey, and I'm a librarian at the Hudson Library, and I will also be moderating tonight's discussion. I'm happy to introduce tonight's author, G. Elliott Morris, who is joining us to talk about his new book, Strength in Numbers, How Polls Work and Why We Need Them. Now, before we get started, we just have a couple of quick announcements. As you know, we have many exciting events around the corner, and we encourage you to check our website, hudsonlibrary.org, for full details, as well as to register. Our current speaker lineup includes such authors as renowned TV chef Nigella Lawson, NPR's legal affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg, and even TV star William Shatner. Just visit our website to learn more and reserve your virtual seat. Now, copies of Morris's book, Strength in Numbers, are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookshop, The Learned Owl. And we're going to go ahead and add a link in the chat for easy purchase. And I also encourage everyone to participate and ask questions throughout tonight's program. If you have any questions about the book, polling, election forecasting, you're probably more of an expert than I am, feel free and submit them your way. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker. G. Elliott Morris is a data journalist and United States correspondent for The Economist, where he writes on a range of topics, including American politics, elections, and public opinion. He studied political science and history at the University of Texas at Austin and began forecasting elections when he was 19. He also writes about politics, government, public opinion, and statistics on his Substack, where you can find him under G. Elliott Morris. So Elliott, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here talking to all y'all.
And you were telling me a little bit before when we were, before everyone joined us publicly, that you actually like talking with libraries a lot. I know you do a lot of academic discussions as well, but there's a little bit something different with libraries.
Well, libraries are good. They're a little more intimate, I guess. I mean, I also grew up going to libraries, so I have a bit of an affinity just for like the vibe, I guess, to use the Generation Z speak. And then, you know, you guys are sort of the target audience, right? So to the extent that citizens will use polling to better democracy, as we'll talk about soon, you're, I mean, sort of taking the message directly to the people.
Great. So before we get really into the weeds of your book, I think it's important, especially with this kind of topic and information, to talk a little bit actually about yourself. And I think a lot of people in the audience might be interested in knowing, how did you find yourself becoming a data journalist and an election forecaster, especially at a particularly young age?
Well, actually, the biography, yeah, it does set the stage for why the book was written. So it's a great place to start. So I took a lot of political statistics courses in college. I think people think political science and they think the arts, but these days it is definitely a science. There's sort of stats, traditional statistics. There's some econometrics in political science. And that training really bridged sort of directly into the data journalism role, because you sort of think about politics all the time, but you have the skill set to go a little bit beyond the traditional, I guess we could call it punditry, that we see in the news most of the time. So, I started election forecasting as a way to learn computer programming when I was in college, and The Economist noticed some of my work, which I was putting out on my blog and on Twitter. And so they sort of hired me when I was directly in college. So I guess cumulatively, I've been paying attention to polls a lot, a lot shorter than a lot of the audience has been paying attention to polls, but it's been a pretty deep study of the information. And we make election forecasting models. So I think there's a lot that people can learn even if they've been studying this for a long time.
Right. And this is your first book, Strength in Numbers. And you've been a journalist, you've been writing articles on your Substack and for The Economist. But I'd like to know a little bit more about what inspired you to take all of your knowledge and your research and create a book about this. And was there anything really insightful that you've learned along the way?
Well, in election forecasting, we spend a lot of time with the numbers, right? Crunching the polling data, trying to figure out who's going to win an election. And then when we're not doing election forecasting, we're just doing traditional political journalism with polls, you're still spending a lot of time thinking about averages of people. But what we're really doing in that process is we're talking about the democratic process, about how people are taking part in their sort of civic duty and their self-government. And that's something that I think gets missed when people consume polling data or when other journalists are writing about polls a lot. I think the sort of heart of the book is in trying to convince people that there's much more to polling than just predicting elections. That's what my education and research sort of turned up. And I felt like that message was missing. So that's why I wrote the book.
And I read the book to prepare for tonight's discussion, and I felt that came across as well, is that there is this kind of like symbiotic relationship between the polling or the will of the people, right, as well as governance of itself. And throughout the book too, we have different main figures, or even some of the fathers of the political polling history, having different opinions on how we are to take this data, right? Are we supposed to just blindly apply what the public wants based on this specific poll? Are we supposed to take it into consideration? There always seems to be this little bit of like a tug of war between how we apply the results from a poll.
Yeah, well, the first pollster that everyone will know of is George Gallup, right? Born in 1901, sort of raised in the early 1900s as journalism, or as a student of journalism, trying to figure out what people sort of wanted from journalists, and later an ad man trying to figure out what people wanted from corporations selling products. He developed some of the early advertising research methodologies, asking people, for example, over the phone, whether or not or in person, whether or not they sort of remembered a product. That was a early gauge, and you can imagine it's pretty imprecise, of whether or not an ad campaign was successful, whether looking at whether or not people remembered things before or after the ad. And that bridges pretty well into polling. You can imagine if you want to know what people want from their news magazine or from Coca-Cola, then that's pretty quickly applicable to what people want from their political leaders. In fact, at one point, George Gallup is quoted later in his life as saying, when he's thinking about what to do next after he's basically getting tired of advertising, he asks himself, well, if it can work for toothpaste, why not politics? So it's important I think, for us to realize that the earliest pollsters are sort of doing this from an ad revenue or early sort of advertising market research perspective. They're very much selling something to the people. And very quickly, that transforms to a more sort of normatively democratic process, something more meaningful. So George Gallup writes this book in 1940 called The Pulse of Democracy. So that's why, in public opinion, you hear a lot about the word pulse being used, or sort of similar metaphors measuring, the lifeblood of democracy or something. And that's sort of what sticks. If you take a public opinion sort of PhD or a political science course, you're going to take a lot of history. So that's also where the book starts. The early sort of philosophies about what people should be, how the will of the people should be incorporated into government. And that is the sort of foundational question about democracy. It's sort of an abstract discussion for us now, but at the time, even in the early 1900s, this is not an abstract discussion, because before George Gallup, they never had this ability to measure what the public thinks, what they want. And so the question, therefore, what you do with that information is going to have huge consequences for democracy down the line. I should say, though, it's not necessarily a settled thing. There is some, some fighting against George Gallup by political science professors. This one character in the book named Lindsay Rogers, for example, writes a whole book calling George Gallup and his sort of associates, his peers, such as Elmo Roper, Archibald Crossley, calling them pollsters, which is not a term that had been used before. We use it neutrally, but Lindsay Rogers is using it as an insult, like you would call someone a huckster, like a pollster. You take polls, you're abusing the tool or whatever. And he is not a fan of the polls. I think he loses out historically. We use polls all the time now. I'm arguing for them for having a role in democracy. But that's not an obvious use case of the polls, even now.
No, and you're right. It seemed like Gallup was quite an eccentric man. Actually, a lot of the different figures you talk about, there's some interesting ones throughout the book. I like the author particularly, the one that wrote the weird dystopian thriller that you wrote in detail about. But the point is there's a lot of interesting characters, and they've always been very opinionated and willing to debate with each other. I mean, Gallup, first, he really rose to prominence by being someone who called on predicted the downfall then of the Literary Digest in their infamous, 1936 poll. Now, I don't know how many people tonight are aware, but obviously polls are not always accurate, right? And maybe in the last couple of presidential polls, we have not had, the results have not turned out as the polls predicted, but they're not immune to that. There have been other years that we've had polls that are way, way off. And this Literary Digest poll is another one of those examples, correct?
Yeah, that's right. An important thing to remember, though, is the Literary Digest poll, even the early Gallup polls, are not nearly as scientific as the surveys we use today, to the extent that the Digest poll gets called a straw poll, which sort of etymologically is basically an accusation that it's what statisticians call today convenient sample, but it's unscientific. You're only getting responses from people who are prone to respond or who you've sort of expressly targeted. So the Digest's problem in 1936 is that they're only asking vote intention among people who have an automobile or if they own a telephone. And so the sort of Digest purchases lists of people who own these things and then sends them postcards to ask them how they vote. They're also only getting responses from people who are really enthusiastic about Alf Landon, the Republican nominee for president that year. And so their poll ends up being 38 percentage points off. They think that Alf Landon is going to win by 14 percentage points. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt wins by 24. And that is actually the worst polling error in modern American history, to the extent that, right, it's not a scientific, because it's not a scientific poll, so it gets called a straw poll. That is also the year George Gallup comes onto the scene. He sees this problem in advance. He sort of predicts, because he spots these methodological problems early, that the poll is going to be off. In fact, he repeats the process with a much smaller sample. The Digest samples 2 million people, and George Gallup samples about 50,000, 35,000 of them, or of different people based on the same lists, and says, this is what the Digest result is going to be. I can do it with a fraction of the sample, and he's right. And his poll is also much closer to the election result. Though I should add, even though he's calling himself a scientific pollster, he's also off by 12 percentage points, which is a much larger error than most of the other polls from even the 2020 election. So yeah, polling error is not new to American history. It used to be much more common. The errors used to be a lot worse. That's sort of why it's so paradoxical now that we are so reactive to what historically are pretty small errors in the election polls.
Let's talk about those reactions then. You bring up a political poll nowadays, and everyone's probably going to have some type of an opinion about it, right? And it seems that people are so, like you said, reactive. When the poll is wrong, it's almost as if it was like a guaranteed shot that this was supposed to happen, like as if we were prophetic seers. Can you talk a little bit about where is this misconnection or this miscommunication between those who are collecting the data, those who are modeling the data, and those who are presenting it to the masses? What's going on?
Sure. As someone who has both conducted polls in the past and communicates or sort of aggregates them and communicates about them now, I see two or three problems that are discussed in the book. The first is that the press doesn't seem to understand this degree of inaccuracy inherent in the surveys. So again, in the 2020 election, the polls are off by about 2 percentage points on average nationally. That means they sort of predicted, in air quotes, that Joe Biden's going to win 54% of the major party vote for president. That's excluding third parties. It's a bit lower, 51 or 53-ish% if you include those. And he gets 52%, or again, 51%, or whatever. So that's a 2 percentage point error, but that's on the major party vote. And that's, compared to 19 percentage points of major party vote error in 1938, 9 to 12 percentage points in 1948, the other big year that polls were wrong, sort of again, wrong. It was a massive improvement over time. And yet still very predictable that polls wouldn't be a perfect tool in 2020, especially after the 2016 presidential election. So when you have journalists after the election or even before the election sort of calling the election for Joe Biden, saying he's absolutely going to win all of these states that the polls suggest he's going to win, with 100% accuracy, or after the fact saying polls are useless because they aren't 100% accurate, that is a misreading of the precision of this tool. So, we try in election forecasting and designing our models to express that uncertainty with a probability. And we say, for example, if there's a polling error as large as 2016 in 2020, then Joe Biden will probably still be president, unless something sort of goes wrong in the electoral vote counting, or sort of if it gets thrown to the House or something, which we can't really predict and we don't try to predict. And that's exactly what happens. And yet, sort of the modelers and the pollsters get decried as being useless. And that seems like the wrong assessment to me. It seems wrong because journalists should understand that the polls are prone to erring. It also seems wrong because the pollsters themselves haven't admitted, I think, to the degree of uncertainty in their data. So the statistical measure for how inaccurate or how uncertain a poll is called the margin of error. You can imagine, say, a poll asking people if they prefer Coke to Pepsi, maybe 50% or something. I'm from the South, so I'm going to count myself in the Coke category. And this margin of error calculation says if you sample 1,000 people in your poll, it could be off by 3 percentage points. So it could be 53% for Coke or it could be 53% for Pepsi. And in political polling, we know that actually this margin of error is about twice as big as the one that I've just told you, about 3%. It should be closer to 6% because of all the other complexities of polling an election. First off, you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know who's going to turn out to vote. We know that everyone doesn't vote. And so therefore you have to make extra predictions about who's going to turn out to vote. But you also don't talk to a representative sample of Americans by random chance, which is what this formula assumes. Instead, pollsters have to do a lot of modeling and statistics to make sure their polls, or again, make sure their polls are representative demographically and politically. So if they talk to too few white or Black Americans or rich or poor Americans or uneducated or non-college educated and college educated Americans, they have to fix those numbers beforehand. But that doesn't solve the problem that what if they're talking to too few Democrats or too few Republicans? Those numbers are unknowable. And so pollsters know that their margin of error is much higher than the one that they're telling most consumers. And yet it's sort of a hard problem to solve. They don't know what the precise estimate of uncertainty is. And so they just give you the one that they know they can calculate, even though they know that it's wrong. So that's also on them. But then it's also on the consumers of the news, I think, to do a bit of due diligence when they're consuming political polls. We know, for example, that there's fake news in other subjects. There's lots of fake news in scientific reporting on medicine or maybe coronavirus. Let's take the past years as an example. And there's also lots of uninformed reporting on the polls too. So there's hopefully the book can serve as a tool to give people some red flags when polls are being misused by journalists or misreported by the pollsters or by the election forecasters or what have you. And some of those heuristics are, if there's not a methodology reported at the bottom of an article, if you don't know what what the question wording for a poll is, then it's sort of, you shouldn't really be trusting the number until you can find those facts. And of course, if it sounds biased, this is a really hard science. So if the article sounds biased, there's just by politics at all, then that's also a red flag and you need to do some more digging. But really, I think this is on the forecasters ultimately. So for the fourth, and that's because, you know, we are giving people a probability, which is hard to understand. And we need to do, I think, a better job. And as an election forecaster, I sort of admit this in the book, we need to do a better job of communicating what these numbers mean. So when I told you earlier that in 2020, if the polls are as wrong as they are in 2016, Biden could still barely win, but it'll be close. I mean, that is a lot easier for people to understand than Joe Biden has a 90% probability of victory. And even though I understand that, I don't think that message has really got through. And so that's, I think, the last thing that needs to change to really help people sort of understand what went wrong in the past. And those are the four things that the book discusses.
Wow, that was very succinct, but we will get into more details, don't worry, because a lot of questions came in while you were explaining that. But there's a lot more questions that will bring out some of the details of your issues. You know, one of the things, I guess we can go ahead and segue a little bit into technology and how technology has really changed polls. Gone are the days of, as you call it, the straw poll, and gone are the days of really the telephone poll. And as we know, especially with the 2012 Barack Obama re-election campaign, it really, you started incorporating what we call big data, right? Where we're getting very large data sets of people, and we're starting to really change how we are going after individuals in terms of polling and what we're asking. My question for you, though, is as we're moving more and more digital with our polling, how is it possible to keep a fair representation of the nation, meaning in terms of age, socioeconomic background, when we're already using a device that eliminates people because the digital divide still exists? So there are people who don't have computers that we can't reach. How are we still keep making an accurate representation of America when we do a poll?
So I think the way to think about this is there are two steps to an accurate poll. First is the designing step of the poll. And that includes how you ask people questions, but also how you target them, whether or not that be over the phone or on the web or text message now. And that design phase, as you point out, excludes certain population from every single mode. People who don't have cell phones or landlines can't answer the cell phone poll or the text message, and if they don't have a computer or don't have a job where they can answer a poll during the day or maybe even at night, maybe they don't have a smartphone, whatever, they can't answer the online poll. So in an industry where one of these, or I'll put it this way, if you have a poll that doesn't have an optimal design, then you have to do a lot more modeling. That's the second step. So after you collect the data, then you have to rely a lot more on statistics to make sure that these populations match up to what the census tells you. So basically, in your case, if you're not getting a lot of older and lower socioeconomic status, which I'm just going to abbreviate as SES because it's easier, people, then you have to count those ones that do answer your poll for a lot more. Basically, you have to count their opinions as more than the one person that you're getting. So if you say, for example, there's 30% or 70% non-college educated Americans, or 70% of adult Americans over 18 are non-college educated. If you only get 35% in your poll that are non-college educated, those ones that you do get have to count double. So in the statistical algorithm, they get a weight of 2. And when you compute the average of people who like Coca-Cola, then those people get counted twice. And the people who have a college degree would be counted as half. And so you have to repeat that process for every single thing that you might think could be correlated or could predict not responding to a poll. So very quickly, that gets like a very complicated process. You have to do it by age, socioeconomic status. You have to do it by gender. There's a gender imbalance in who takes the surveys. There's imbalances further by your income, and interactions of these things. So certain groups in certain categories are even more likely to respond or not respond to surveys than you would predict by their individual traits. And that's a math problem. That's a statistics problem. And when you have very low response rates to surveys, like 1%, 1 to 2% now, that means if I call 100 people, 1 will respond to me, which makes surveys very expensive. It also means that this math problem gets even harder because those 99 people that you're not getting could be weird, statistically weird in ways that you can't predict with your modeling. And so really the answer is you have to do both. If you have an online poll, you can merge that together with a poll that you think is designed better over the phone or that reaches people via text message. And you can't just call 1,000 people and not do any of the mathematical sort of adjustments that I've just described, because we know that those 99 other people that you're not reaching are going to be different than the one person that you're reaching out of that sample universe, out of that population. So good polls today exist. Well, we could say they exist between a good design and a good model, but really they're doing both well at the same time. They're mixing the ways that they're contacting people, and they're doing a lot of math and statistics after they're talking to them. And that means that polls are really hard to explain. They're really hard for people to intuit the accuracy of them. And it means that polling journalists have to basically learn how polls work themselves so they can vet information before they report on the polls. And that is essentially the second half of the book. After we talk about the history, it's about methods. It's about learning how polls work so that journalists who read the book can do this job better.
And consumers can just, as I read it, and as you learn about the modeling and the ranking and the Mr. P, and yes, there's something called Mr. P, there's a lot more to it. And like you said, the complexity compared to a straw poll, it's much, much more complex to the point where it becomes a little bit harder to visualize than just gathering people and taking a raise your hand. How do you feel about this specific topic? And isn't that true? So now we have these polls and they're online and there's a little bit more variations in them. And there might be a little bit more error in them. Isn't that why we now lead to aggregating polls, where we're taking selections of polls and bringing them together and then modeling these polls, right, to create the aggregate consensus?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So if you have, well, even in the era when 70% of people were responding to surveys, there is the chance that if you're only looking at 1 or 2 polls, by random chance, in a close election or a sort of wildly competitive one, that the survey is going to be wrong. And that's because even if it's designed well and it's reaching a representative sample of Americans, it might not be reaching a representative sample of voters, of actual voters, people who turn up on election day. And that's simply because you cannot sample that group ahead of time because you don't know what it is or how to reach it. You don't get to play the election once and then do the polls again. There's a quote by Elmo Roper's son. He's another pollster in the late 1980s when he says this is basically the hardest job of polling because the group is ephemeral. They do not exist beforehand. And that's true now. We have more sophisticated technologies now to be able to predict who's going to vote. There is a discussion in the book about so-called voter files, which record whether or not you've turned out to vote in the past and then sell that information to voter targeting companies or to pollsters. And so we can use even more math and statistics to make guesses, really pretty good guesses at who's going to vote ahead of time. But again, that's adding another source of uncertainty to the polls. And so that causes even higher errors in surveys. So sorry, sort of to answer your question, aggregation, even early on, is necessary. And it's even more necessary now because we have higher uncertainty in the data. But it doesn't fix everything, as we've seen recently. If you have high error in individual surveys, aggregation helps you sort of filter out the noise, to use sort of the terminology of Nate Sulfur, from the signal, because you have the idea is you have all of these inputs and their errors are sort of not correlated. The idea is all the polls are not going to be off in the same direction. So you can average them together and you'll have an accurate prediction. But we know now in 2020 that that is not the right theory, that there is something underlying in the population that is causing almost all of the polls to be inaccurate in election predictions, or we should say biased in election prediction. So even if you have low error, low noise, if you have high bias, then aggregation is not going to solve your problem. And that's sort of what's dangerous now. Because response rates are so low, 1%, one out of every 100 people is responding to your poll, the chance that you can predict why that one single person answered your poll with demographic attributes that are captured on the census alone is much lower than it needs to be to conduct accurate surveys. And we don't have partisanship on the census. We don't know the correct composition of Democrats and Republicans either, and that's really the big problem. So even if you have a poll that's perfectly distributed on its demographics, those sort of non-college educated white voters or high SES Black voters or what have you that are answering could still be politically biased. And that's why aggregation is not working, because of the bias, not because of the error.
Gotcha. Now, you brought this up, and I've been thinking about it since you just mentioned this a few moments ago. I'm just curious, so when Obama was running for re-election, the phone in my house ran constantly. We still had a landline constantly. My mother was a hot poller. Like, her name got out. Everyone wanted her opinion. How are we finding these people today? Because no one ever asks for my opinion. I've never received anything. My friends haven't received anything. I asked my colleagues, they haven't received anything. So who are these people that are being found, and how are they being contacted?
Well, the first thing is, if you have a landline, you're much likelier to get a survey because it's a lot easier to dial a landline and it's a lot cheaper. And that's because the US law says you can have a computer randomly dial landline numbers. You cannot have a computer randomly dial cell phone numbers. So that means all these pollsters, at least the ones that are doing it correctly, have to hire groups of people like you and me to sit in a library or in a university, in some dark room of a university campus somewhere, and physically dial the cell phone numbers. So if you have a cell phone, it's much more unlikely that you will receive a survey than if you have a landline. But maybe you have a landline, so you're still perplexed by this. And the answer to that is you are what would be considered low value respondent to lots of pollsters. And that's not because your opinion counts for less, but it's because your type of person, a young person, a white person, is easily reachable by pollsters somewhere else in the country. So if they already talk to someone like you, then they don't need to talk to you. And they need to instead spend their money and resources talking to what are called high value respondents, people that are hard to poll. So it has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with how many people like us live in the country and how many people who don't look like us or show up to sort of libraries to talk about polls that they haven't been able to talk to so far. And then the other answer is that, out of 350 million people, if you're talking to 1,000, your chance of getting polled is also very, very low. There's this great book, actually it's on my bookshelf, by a pollster at CBS News called "Where Did You Get This Number?" by Anthony Salvanto. And it answers lots of questions like this in a really fun, entertaining sort of behind the scenes way. And so I'll let him answer these questions because I think he does a much better job than I do. But that's it.
No, thank you for that, because like I said, we don't have a landline anymore. And as soon as the landline went away in my house, the requests have stopped. So I was just curious. So your number one recommendation is to get a landline. I will do that.
Yeah, I need to do that too. I only have my cell phone. So.
Well, and so many cell phones nowadays too. Like, for example, my cell phone has the Google Pixel phones will actually do like the call filtering. Like, so all those car warranty scammers and stuff, like I never even know they call. So I can imagine it's much harder to get a hold of people, even if you are using cell phones numbers to contact people. So the response rate, just because the society and the culture has changed so much in terms of what technology we use and how we communicate, that's probably harder to get people to participate.
Yeah, the societal and the technological change has meant that has been a double-edged sword for response rates. It has absolutely nothing to do with sort of the value of polling, I think, normatively, or like what pollsters are doing and everything with how basically our lives are not set up to answer a random person calling us. There was a time a few years ago, I wrote this story about how Verizon, I think AT&T as well, were thinking about call blocking, not on the phone level, but at the like Verizon telecom center level, where none of the no calls that weren't registered would make it through. And that would have been a disaster for pollsters, because they can't like set sort of a name. Sorry, no phone call that was registered in your phone at Verizon Center would make it to you. So unless like the Pew Research Center or CBS News got every single American to add their their pollster number to their phones, then they wouldn't make it through. Now that hasn't happened, which is good for the pollsters, but is also sort of bad for us who still get calls about their car's extended warranty when they don't have a car. And that's just going to continue to be a problem. People aren't going to pick up calls from people they don't know. And maybe that's how it should be, but it's hard. That makes it hard for pollsters.
And now, totally call me out if I'm wrong. I'm not an economist, and you know this. We talked about this. But because people aren't answering the phone and people don't, online, you're not getting quite the representative sample. I know straw polls were not as scientifically proven, but is there any movement by any type of polling designers to say, let's go back out to where the people are? We know they're at the grocery store. We know they're here. Maybe the fair, wherever, and actually talk to people one-on-one, because maybe you're more likely to get a response if someone is actually standing in front of you.
That is a very good question. It's an interesting, I hadn't thought about like pollsters going to grocery stores. They haven't thought about that level. Their problems essentially are not that big that they would need to go to, around town on their feet to interview. But they have gone back to a methodology we haven't talked about yet, and that is fielding scientifically polls over the Postal Service via mail. It was back in the Literary Digest's time, they would just sample basically every single person they could get off of a list of telephone and automobile owners. Other pollsters did this too and quickly abandoned the method. But now the US Postal Service has something called the Master Address List, which is, as it sounds, literally the list of every single post office box or place you can receive mail in the country. And that means pollsters can randomly sample off of that. As long as the Postal Service records that someone lives there, pollsters can randomly assign us again into receiving the surveys. So we don't have this problem of having to sign up for the internet panels or to have our cell phones connected. Pollsters can still find us. And they found that the Pew Research Center and CNN are the sort of leaders in going back to this methodology. At least when I wrote the book, they were in early 2022. Things are changing very rapidly these days. They find that these polls are less biased politically. They're less biased on religion, so they get more evangelicals and they get more Republicans and conservatives than the other methods of polls do, which is great news. And even better, these mail surveys, at least the ones that the Pew Research Center does, and I'll explain in a sec why it's not necessarily externally valid or why it might not apply to other pollsters. They find a response rate nearly 30% instead of 1 or 2%. And that would essentially get rid of this demand for very complex statistical models and like sort of millions of dollars spent on research and new technologies to make the polls accurate. And the reason Pew Research Center is able to do this is because they spend a lot of money on the design phase. They're not only sending, say they select me for a survey or someone in the audience, participant number 40 or whatever, for a poll and sending you one postcard. They will send you a postcard. And if you don't respond, they'll send you another postcard. And if you don't respond, they'll send you a little envelope with a cutout window with a $1 bill. And then the third time, they'll send you a $10 bill. And the fourth time, if you still haven't responded, they will send you a manila envelope that says like urgent. It's a registered piece of mail, so it sort of looks fancy in the Postal Service. And it says Pew Research Center wants to hear from you. And then you don't go online to fill out the survey as you would do in the other methods. They print out the survey in a questionnaire, and you can fill it out and mail it back. Now, of course, every pollster is not going to be able to do this, But if the Pew Research Center can do this and get benchmarks that they can share with other pollsters for the share of Americans who are conservative or what have you, then maybe that helps the other pollsters. And maybe alternatively, we just start to trust pollsters like the Pew Research Center more than the other pollsters who we think aren't putting this much effort into their polls. And that's sort of the position that I've taken recently. Now, that's hard, right? Like, we don't know how to empirically quantify, trusting more or whatever, but at least in our reporting or in as news consumers and how we digest this information, that's something that we have to factor into. But hey, again, I told you earlier that this stuff's getting more complicated, and it's almost we almost have to have a degree in polling to really understand it at this rate. So that's what journalists are here for.
Yeah, but I'm glad to hear that we are kind of going a little bit old school, right, with the mailing, because I do think that is important to reach, different swaths of people. And I do think that that is a little less, it's the incentive part with like the money and the envelope and things like that. I can understand why you would be able to boost your response rate like that. Now you're talking about, we have a lot of questions coming in, and I promise we'll get through most of those. Don't worry, everybody, but please feel free to add questions if you still have any. I do want to talk about one chapter in your book was very eye-opening to me, is that not all polls are made equal, and I'm sure you know that. And sometimes polls can even be damaging. And the one that really shocked my eyes was the one regarding, do sanctions against Saddam Hussein contribute to the death of children? And the repercussions, serious repercussions that this poll has had. And your book talks about not only the repercussions of the poll, but also investigations that involve the poll afterwards. But really, you kind of mentioned there's no oversight, correct, into polling. So if there is a blatantly fraudulent poll or a poll that is made to be purposefully misleading or fraudulent, there is no oversight, correct?
Yeah, that's right. You don't submit a poll to like a panel of peer reviewers like you would do for a scientific article. And so that introduces a slew of issues. There's a problem with low quality surveys that aren't sort of vetted, that aren't conducted what we would think of as correctly nowadays. There's a problem of ideological bias among surveyors. And essentially, in most Western democracies today, you have pretty siloed media ecosystems where people will hear about news that they agree with. And you can imagine pollsters are also, that are in your sort of bubble, are also hearing, or maybe not your bubble, but a bubble, that are sort of hearing the same news and have their own opinions, want to ask questions about that topic in a way that gives them results that they can then give back to the information ecosystem, creating a sort of feedback loop. So that's another problem. But the big problem, the one you raise, is what happens if there's just a problem in the survey, an innocent problem in the research design that causes a huge scandal. So actually, this is sort of the part of the book that's like sort of the sexy part of the book that's supposed to sell the book. So I won't give you all the details to the extent that polls are sexy. But you have this case in the 1990s where a survey, and here I'm using the word poll and survey interchangeably, an academic poll or an academic survey is conducted among Iraqi households in partnership between some academics and the Iraqi government to ask people if they've lost a kid to sanctions. So imagine, this is going to be a sort of a hard exercise, but imagine someone comes to your door in the middle of an economic depression and asks you, one of them's wearing like a white survey hat and the other one is marked as a member of the government. Hey, are the sanctions from these other countries hurting you? You might be predisposed to say yes, because your like social circle doesn't like them, or because your neighborhood doesn't like them, or because the person that's asking you the question is from the government. And so you tell them yes. And so these surveys statistically overestimate mortality from sanctions in Iraq, according to a political or an economist named Michael Spaggett in London. And it's not just these surveys, though. It's most of the surveys that are conducted about mortality from the pre-Iraq War sanctions regime and the war itself. And it's not just academic surveys, it's also surveys conducted for the US State Department. And so in another two examples discussed in the book, the error is now not because a government worker is asking the poll, but because there's evidence of outright fraudulation or sort of fraudulent survey responses by interviewers and by supervisors of those interviewers. And there's other biases where some people are not asking questions in the most war-torn parts of the country, and therefore sort of overestimating, which tended to be less populous, and overestimating mortality, therefore, by the war, estimating millions of people had died instead of hundreds of thousands. And you can imagine in the US State Department seeing that like millions of people had died from sanctions or from violence in the country. What is the United States government's response to this information? Well, it might be more regime building, it might be more war. We don't really know. All we know is that the surveys weren't accurate, but they're still being used to make decisions. And so that brings up a problem of misuse of surveys. We've talked already about problems with them polluting the information environment about elections, or them being used in a positive way to help democracy, to sort of help the people get what they want from their government. And that's where a lot of the book spends, that's where I spend a lot of time in the book. There's also this problem where if you don't have oversight, then anything can happen. And sometimes we have some examples of some pretty bad things happening. And that's an argument for more oversight of the industry. So I started by saying there's no peer review for a poll. I mean, if you're doing an academic study, it should be peer reviewed by the relevant academic journal. But if you're just publishing the poll in the media, then the people who are your peer reviewing, they're not your peers, they're news consumers, they're not other survey researchers. And so you can make mistakes. So that's an argument for polls being supervised more closely by the existing society of pollsters called the American Association of Public Opinion Research, who certainly could have said at the time of this Iraq survey, this is wrong, stop reporting on it. Or in the case of ideological surveys, could say these outlets are ideologically biased, don't listen to them, don't report on them, other journalists, but they haven't sort of done those things. Maybe another organization will step up and somehow make that possible, but this is really APOR's responsibility.
I just think because the data is going through so many different hands and then being interpreted, and the end result is the consumer who can't extrapolate, or they might not understand, especially with complex modeling, like you say, that we have today, that there should be some type of oversight or some type of checks in place to warn people, that this may be inaccurate, you know what I mean? Because as you and I talked about before, there's always been a discussion about how much of a result of political data do we actually use directly to make decisions. And so if there is something that could be potentially really dangerous, it can then have a domino effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
No,
so there are two direct examples from the book of the domino effect here. The first example is from this sort of sanction trouble in pre-US war Iraq, where the findings are reported on by Leslie Stahl in an interview with Madeleine Albright on TV, in which she says, like, the sanctions are worthwhile because we stopped 500,000 deaths in Iraq, a number that has proven to be false. So, how would she have reported on that differently? How would the US government have made their decisions differently in pre-war Iraq? We really don't know the answer to those questions.
Right. So we have a ton of questions from the audience. Now, some of them we've already touched on a little bit throughout the evening, so those ones may not be asked, but there is someone in the audience, looks like Alan. Alan wants to know a little bit more regarding midterm elections, the current polls about the midterms, as well as the chances for Mr. Trump to win midterm election. Maybe looking into 2024, I'm guessing, for him. So obviously that 2024, that's a far, far way away. I'm sure there's a lot of things and a lot of elements that can change that. But what is the current landscape looking for midterms? We're right around the corner.
Well, now that it's Labor Day, I think we're allowed to talk about polls again. I mean, there's there's this saying that campaign starts at Labor Day, and there's some statistical evidence to say polls before Labor Day are pretty unreliable. But so now that we're after Labor Day, we're allowed to talk about it. The polls right now are good for the Democrats in the Senate and not so good for them in the House, where Democrats need to win by an outsized margin because of biases against them in sort of the chamber and the single member districting system. So I'll just talk about the Senate, where Democrats are ahead in a few key races in Pennsylvania, where Republicans currently have a Senate seat, and where the Democrats might pick up a seat in Ohio. And then the Democrats are doing well in all of their close states that they currently possess, like Arizona, where the astronaut Mark Kelly is running again, and New Hampshire, and in Nevada. But in your home state, here's sort of where things get tricky, because I'm sure people in Ohio will remember the 2020 and 2016 elections where the polls said similar things. The election was close in both scenarios. In 2020, the polls said Ohio is exactly tied, but Donald Trump ends up winning the state by 8 percentage points. So we can do a fun little exercise. We can say, okay, count up the states Democrats are winning now according to the average of polls. It's 51 states, or 52 states if you're using particularly optimistic numbers. In other words, using the Wisconsin or Ohio numbers, and taking them at face value. But if you don't take them at face value, what do things look like now? Well, now, if you're assuming polls are as biased as they were in 2020 and 2016, the Democrats are losing in New Hampshire, they're losing a seat in Georgia, and they're losing all the competitive seats except for Pennsylvania, and Arizona is also really close. So that means they could be at 47 or 48 seats instead of 51. So that is sort of where things stand. Things look good. But if you're the type of person who doesn't want to be burned by the polls again, and you're a Democrat, or maybe you're looking for a source of optimism and you're a Republican, then you should use the adjusted numbers, which show a much tighter race, potentially one where Democrats are in trouble. And the sort of point from the book is, if I had to make a prediction now, I would say polls would be biased like they were in the past. And if you read the book, you'll understand that that's because this problem of political non-response, of Republicans and conservatives not answering polls as often as Democrats, is not a problem that magically goes away. And it's something that pollsters have to pay a lot of attention to correct, or to attempt to correct. And even then, there's no surefire solution. But if you're a Democrat and you want good news, the good news is that these patterns of non-response can change really quickly. And that makes them harder for me to predict. That might give you some hope, but we are in a close election, and essentially we're in a close election, and the polls, if they're wrong again, indicate Republicans would probably be ahead. That's how close the election is.
And of course, there's still plenty of time for everything.
And there's plenty of time. Yeah, we're still far away. Yeah.
Now you brought up an important thing, the non-responsiveness, and there are many articles and things like that written about what happened in 2016, 2020. We've had the shy Trump voter, the non-responsiveness. Eric has a question too. It kind of goes along that train of thought in a lot of those articles. How do pollsters deal with the issue of specific political groups of people answering questions dishonestly to try to influence an election? Does it happen? Is it statistically relevant, where it happens enough that it can actually affect a poll?
The academic research says that not enough people lie to pollsters to bias the poll. So if you call 1,000 people, you might get a few liars, outright liars. But if you're doing your data quality checks and making sure that people who are actually, that you're actually talking to are engaged in the process, you're not going to get a lot of liars. You will, however, get some people who just aren't paying attention. And this is also, I should note, a really hard problem to solve. And that is because if there's a lot of people who are not being honest to polls that you're talking to, then there's a sort of even larger group of people who aren't being honest in the group that you can't talk to. And because pollsters are already self-selecting into people who want to talk to the poll, they're sort of not able to study the group of people who might be predisposed to lie to surveys or to exaggerate or what have you. And so it's really hard so I can't say as a consumer of these academic studies that like people don't lie to you. I can just say the academic studies say people don't necessarily lie to pollsters enough to change what the polls in aggregate are saying. Really, the problem is that we don't have enough Republicans answering surveys. That's a much simpler explanation.
I know you don't have the answer, but is there anything that people are trying to do to get them to become more responsive? I know there are some polling aggregates like at Rasmussen, right, that does tend to poll conservatives and Republicans more. Is there more work being done by other groups to try and get them to participate more?
Well, there's two ways you could do this. You can take the Rasmussen method, which is to somewhat arbitrarily upweight the number of Republicans in the electorate, assuming by fiat that everyone else is wrong and you're right. This is dangerous statistically. It means that Rasmussen tends to overestimate Republicans. But hey, I mean, we've had 3 elections in a row where almost all the other pollsters overestimated Democrats. So if they're overestimating Republicans, they are sort of by definition going to look more accurate and maybe help improve our averages too. So I'm not going to say don't listen to the data, but that's one way you could do it. You can do it after the fact. The other way is, like we were talking about earlier, to design the polls that will reach the more representative group of people from the outset. And that's where most of the research is being done. And you can't really convince people to answer surveys if they're not paying attention to the news or listening to the pollsters already. That's a pretty hard problem to solve. To increase people's trust in the random person on the other end of the phone who's calling them, or to increase their trust enough in news organizations that they already don't trust that are calling them to ask them questions, right? These are sort of not problems that you can just flip a switch and fix. The hope is among pollsters is that the errors in 2016 and 2020 were caused, again, this is the hope, I don't necessarily believe it, by Donald Trump telling Republicans not to answer the polls, that the pollsters in the mainstream media were rigged against Republicans and conservatives. And so therefore the polling error in those years was caused by Donald Trump. Now, I find no evidence of this because the polls were still sort of off in 2018 and Donald Trump hasn't gone away. So it's not like that's gonna really reassure people in 2022, and I don't think it should reassure them in 2024 either.
Okay, so a lot of work. It's not fixed yet. All right.
It is a pretty bleak picture to be fair.
I don't want to be negative, Elliott. Okay. Let's see. Brad has an interesting question. Since Ohio, especially in presidential elections, we have gone more conservative. We used to be a very bellwether state. What are the current bellwether states to really be watching anymore?
Great question. The states that have been most competitive in recent elections, so for a bellwether, you want a state that is a sort of microcosm as the country of the country as a whole. And the way we do that, so the easy way we do that, is to pick the states where the Democratic margin in the recent presidential election is as close as possible to what it was nationally. And those states recently have been Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Not Ohio, not Florida, not Texas, states that have been much more Republican than the nation as a whole. So you can look to the behavior of those states. Those states tend recently to predict outcomes, but that's no assurance of the future. Ohio was, as you're noting, a bellwether by this definition in 2008 and 2012 for much of the 20th century, and only recently is not this bellwether. And that's a sort of flip switched basically across the nation to make Ohio not as representative.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening. I know that this is a very dense topic, might overwhelm people, but it's really important to understand. As you mentioned, it's, we have the data literacy, right? To understand polling literacy, reading polls, knowing if it's a good poll, understanding the margin of error, and if it should be larger than what it's being accounted for. That and so much more is in this, especially if you're a history buff. There's some very enigmatic characters in the history of polling, that it makes it very enjoyable, even if you're not an economist, even if you don't dive into the data. So I just want to say thank you so much, Elliott, for your time this evening. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in to watch.
It was really my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, again, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. I wish everyone the best. Have a great evening.